Hello, welcome to episode 2 of my 7-part series on Nestor Makhno, entitled We're Raising the Curtain on Makhno, 1888 to 1910. Nestor Ivanovich Makhno was born in 1888 in Schlierf, Ukraine. Please forgive my pronunciation, I do not speak Ukrainian and can only approximate. He was born into a situation that is not dissimilar to the American South during Reconstruction. In the 1860s, both the Ukraine and America had finally abolished the odious institution, slavery and serfdom, but the landed interests, the people with money and skin in the game, were able to hire back their former serfs for almost no wages and still perpetuate the system. The Mennonites that we talked about in the last episode, who were invited by Catherine's son Paul, moved in force in the 1860s, and they had a number of exclusive rights, like the ability to create and resale alcohol that usually only the state could do. And so the divisions are very clear. Upper-class landowners, where Makhno grew up, a lot of them were Mennonites. And then Ukrainian land-poor peasants who did all the work for the landowners. Farmers, basically. Nestor Ivanovich Makhno was one of several children. His father died young, and he also began work young. He started working at 12 on the Janzin estate, and it was physically difficult work, bringing in harvests, taking care of farm animals, driving them, that sort of thing. And Nestor Ivanovich was not a big strapping lad at any time in his life, sort of the wiry, gangly, short. He looks a little bit like Oscar Wilde, depending on the photo you get of him. But there was something about the kid. He wasn't superhumanly charismatic, but he could make friends fairly quickly. He actually does make a rather significant friend who proves rather influential. He became friends with the people who hired him. In particular, their son, Abram, whose father had also died, and the scholar Patterson speculates that this sort of lack of fathers in their life created the bond between the two boys that would very much help the Janzins in the later Russian Civil War and help them escape from the Ukraine with their lives. Nestor Makhno worked very hard for very little money and did the standard what a good boy should do in this situation, despite beatings and hard work, and take that little money right back to Mama, who would see to the house and all of her sons and daughters. It was a difficult life, but Makhno did not know any better. In his memoirs, he says, you learn to turn an eye away from the brutality of your life in order to survive it. Beatings and whippings were common. The Mennonites, the worst of the Mennonites, viewed the Russians and the Ukrainians as a naturally criminal people. There's one Mennonite source that said, they don't take it personally. You have to beat them a couple times, and they'll steal anything that's not nailed down, but they're good workers for all that. So we're getting right into the tensions that were created in part because of Catherine the Great's policies that we discussed on a previous episode. Turns out, policy decisions outlive the people who make them, so that's fun. 1905 is the next major landmark in Makhno's life. 1905 is the less famous, but I would argue more important, aborted Russian Revolution. That is another attempted uprising to overthrow the Tsarist Empire. Now, Russia had sort of been slowly pulling apart as an empire for a while now, and this revolution further pulled it apart, but didn't quite kick down the door. The Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, were merciless in their crackdown, and a lot of people died. across the Russian Empire. This is Nestor Makhno's awakening into anarchist principles. He begins reading forbidden literature, anarcho-communist literature, that is, by definition, anti-state power, pro-Ukrainians having the ability to own their own land and farm it as they see fit. And that just means that you have to kill the landlords, kill the secret police, and rally the peasants around this common cause. And he joins what is called the Free Peasants' Union of Hulia-Polye, the nearest city to him. There's a famous account from a Mennonite source of what the worst of the Mennonite landlords and farm owners could do to someone like Nestor Makhno. A wealthy Mennonite was driving by in his carriage and saw Nestor harnessing 3 pigs to a sled, like they were horses, harmless sort of country bumpkin fun. And the Mennonite was so offended by this, he orders his carriage pulled over, summons an overseer, and has Makhno brutally flogged in front of an audience of about 20 people. According to the Mennonite account, gouts of blood were coming out of Makhno's back that were like a meter long. It's very theatrical and bloody, and he's a wreck. But this is a story that demonstrates that not all Mennonites were part of a monolithic exploitive class. Because we're going to meet, for the first and only time in the story, Old Lady Kolsnik. Old Lady Kolsnik is, at this time, a woman who lives in the top section of a barn, the sort of in-law suite, nearby, and witnesses Nestor Ivanovich Makhno getting the tar beat out of him for little to no reason. And she takes the steps, 3 or 4 at the time, rushes out of her apartment, and according to the Mennonite oral source we have, decks the overseer in the face and asks him what the hell does he think he's doing, he ought to be ashamed of himself. And picks up Nestor Makhno, or lends him her shoulder, and brings him up the steps to her apartment, where he stays and recuperates for 2 months under her care. He can't work for 2 months because someone who was driving by didn't like what he was doing. No more reason than that. In 1907, the Free Peasants' Union of Hulia-Polye really starts to up its game. Makhno talks about in his diaries and memoirs. He talks about going into the countryside, finding the landlord's property that weren't as guarded as they could be, and burning what they could down. He talks about fires that wouldn't go out for a week because no one was there to put them out. And this sort of low-level terrorism continues to build. It also gets Makhno quite a reputation. Several times he's on the run from the secret police, and the Mennonite people he works for give him shelter. They hide him, because the Okrana are not fun people. This, again, would save several families' lives later down the road. Anyway, part of this low-level resistance to Tsarist oppression involves, as all things do when you get to a certain point, assassination. The Okrana are not nice people. For the longest time, the Free Peasants' Union of Hulia-Polye has their eye on the chief of police. And it's not to ask him to a dance, it's to kill him. Alexander Skurda, one of Makhno's many biographers, describes the chief of police of Hulia-Polye as Sherlock Holmes-like. I'm not sure he really deserves that title, because the back and forth between the chief of police and the Free Peasants' Union of Hulia-Polye seems more Looney Tune-ish than Sherlock Holmesian to me. Makhno is brought in, despite his best efforts at evading them, several times, And when you're brought in by the police, remember this is well before the Miranda Code, and that's only a US thing anyway, beatings, stress positions, threats against your family are pretty common for the Tsarist police. We do have the testimony of a few people who knew Makhno at this time, and they talk about how his eyes wouldn't change no matter what you had him doing. Whether he's being beaten or shouted at, he'd just sort of look at you. It's very unnerving, even if he wasn't a physically intimidating guy. Anyway, the quest for the chief of police's head, after numerous feints, arrests, and failed bombing attempts, at this time, the cheap availability of DIY bombs was a real scourge through the Tsarist administration. It ends in perhaps the most hilarious way you can assassinate someone, short of a cream pie, with the head of the Free Peasants' Union of Huliepolye writing a letter to the chief of police and postmarking it as from France. The letter, in fact, says, in essence, "Dear Chief of Police, boy, it's sure good to be in a country with free speech. France! I am there. I dare you to come over to here and have a nice free speech with me. Free chat." I'm pretty sure that if he could have gotten away with it, the head of the Free Peasants Union would have signed the letter with a pictograph of a chicken. And the head of the secret police, or the police of Huliepolye, takes this letter as, "Oh, well, fantastic! That dangerous anarchist who I am not happy about is at least out of the country, and therefore out of my head. Time to take in a show without any of my guards. This is a good day to be me." And, of course, it doesn't quite turn out that way at all. Because Semeniuta, the head of the Free Peasants Union of Ukraine and friends of Makhno, one of Makhno's role models as it turns out, had actually not left the country. He had in fact followed the chief of police, and when the chief of police left the play, Semeniuta popped out from behind a tree, doubtless said something witty, and then blew his brains out. Huzzah! On the other hand, this great triumph of the Free Peasants' Union of Huliepolye was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory because it did get the majority of them arrested that were directly involved in this. And pretty much without fail, the judge hands down the death sentence to everyone, including the 17-year-old Makhno. And then there's one of these little twists of fate, thing you don't expect. In the Russian Empire at this time, you are not legally considered an adult until you are 21 years of age, and Makhno is only 17. So the judge thinks, would be a shame to kill a minor. We are a horrible Tsarist empire, but we have standards, sometimes. So, young man, here's what we're going to do. We are going to commute your death sentence, Makhno. And we will just replace it with life imprisonment and hard labor. So a death sentence then. Well, what are you going to do? Makhno is sent to the Bertia prison in Moscow. Russian prisons have a reputation for being uniquely bad, and this one was no exception. Makhno was frequently beaten, racked by disease, and put in solitary confinement because he was not the sort to suffer in silence. At some points, he had to be chained for days or months at a time. You know, the ankle chain runs through the waist to the hands. It looked like the end of Makhno's short, violent, and eventful life. It looked like the curtain was going to fall. But all that changes, and we'll see what those changes are in the next episode.